This is the Amazing Education Podcast. Powered by the Ames Community School District, I'm your host, Eric Smith. On today's episode, we are joined by Dr. Katy Swalwell. We're going to have an amazing conversation in this second of 2 episodes on critical consciousness and how school districts can have conversations about inequities and racism. Dr. Katy Swalwell, this is a part 2.
Part 2.
We have never done
Encore.
a part 2 on the Amazing Education Podcast.
I'm honored.
It flies by so
it
fast.
Does go fast.
And we have so much to talk to.
Yeah, you're not asking easy questions. I think that makes it hard. Yeah.
This is not an easy topic. I think which maybe that's what makes it even that much more important that we have this conversation, because we could do a part 3, I guarantee it.
Yeah, we could.
So if you are just coming on to this episode, I do encourage you to go back 1 episode and listen to that one first, because we're going to pick up where we left off on this episode. And so it's incredibly important that I think you kind of get a basis for what we're talking about. And the topic is around critical consciousness and the important reasons why we have these conversations in school districts, and we talk about inequities and privilege and who is benefiting from what. And there's a lot of this that is happening within our buildings, within our district and system as a whole, that we don't even know about at times.
Well, and I think that's an important thing to point out too, especially given the work the district's doing. I can totally understand why some people who know that the district has been doing this professional development with me and Dr. Spikes around critical consciousness, and then feels like, so why did this messed up thing happen in my school? I thought the district was working on this. I think this goes so deep, and there's so many nooks and crannies for inequity and disparities and different forces of oppression, really, to hide out and make homes in. Again, regardless of people's individual intent, that even if, the district is deeply committed to this, but even with that level of commitment, it takes a long time and effort and energy and attention and just nonstop deliberate focus to just keep rooting things out and to keep surfacing ways that all of this is deeply embedded in the life of a school. So it doesn't surprise me at all, even years from now, that there will still be issues and still be concerns that are voiced and that are identified. And I think ideally the district that is critically conscious and equity oriented isn't the district that has 0 problems. I mean, we're humans, so I don't think that's likely to happen, but it's a district that responds really beautifully and thoughtfully and swiftly when issues arise. Yeah. And ideally you're, tamping down the number of incidents, like you don't have as many issues, but there will still be things that pop up. You have new people coming on board. You have, there's all sorts of reasons why you won't have like a 0 issue institution.
Well, growth is not perfect, and I'll attribute this to either you or Daniel, but we'll never be a fully critically conscious district or myself, a person. It
wish.
Never ends.
I know. I mean, I wish that it came to that point. And I think, especially for people, when you're doing the work on your dominant identities, which for me would be like my racial identity, my racialized identity, or my social class identity, or my citizenship status, like my language. Like I have lots of parts of me that are privileged and advantaged. And because they're my advantage, I just feel like sometimes like, I have to keep working on this all the time. You have to just so consciously keep forcing yourself to work. And because it's your dominant identity, you can take a break. Yeah. And if it's not, you can never take a break. So I try to remind myself, and for people who have a mix of dominant, non-dominant identities, it's kind of nice because you can empathize, like, if it's my non-dominant identity, there's no escape. There's no break. So that level of exhaustion is like totally different. Yeah. But that to me is the incentive to keep going, is that there are, even though it is really sometimes super painful, sometimes really embarrassing, really difficult work to just constantly be reflecting and thinking about the ways to engage better with the world, that the reward is when it works, that you have much more meaningful, authentic relationships with people, that you are able to actually see the lifting of a burden off of someone or the removal of an obstacle. Like, there's enormous reward in that.
Yeah.
And so even if sometimes it feels like we're pushing, 1,000 pounds to go 1 millimeter, that millimeter really matters to people. And that, the work has to continue even when we don't necessarily see a huge benefit right away.
So there are a couple layers to growth in this. So there's individual personal growth, and we all need to be working towards that. And then there's a system approach where it's a bunch of people having conversations based on their personal growth and addressing, you said like policies and practices and procedures. And those things are working in tandem because they're all impacting students. And I'm going to out myself. Okay. So our conversation prior to going live, we were having a conversation, and I said one of the most cliche things that I just read about yesterday in White Fragility, and I outed myself, and that's part of the process. Sure. And so let's talk about one hurdle, which I know you've experienced, and that is white fragility.
I've experienced it both ways. Like, I have felt it as a white person. I still feel it as a white person, even a white person who has really consciously committed to engaging in anti-racist work. And then I've been on the other side where I'm trying to work with other fellow white people to kind of get on the anti-racist bandwagon, like get on board, and have experienced it as like a facilitator in that role. So yeah, it is very real. So
what is it?
So White Fragility in a nutshell. I mean, this book you're reading, I think, is really fabulous, by Robin DiAngelo. It's basically the sense that, and it's based on this idea of any dominant identity, and white fragility is talking specifically about whiteness as a dominant racialized identity, that to have it questioned, to have it critiqued, makes people with that identity super uncomfortable and nervous and anxious. And so what that ends up producing is, when you're trying to have these conversations, this sense that we have to cater to the needs of the white person who's uncomfortable. And what scholars who are anti-racist and are thinking about white fragility would push back on is to say, that can't be what's at the center, right? Because whiteness will always want to protect itself. And so that can't be what we think about. So we can't prioritize the discomfort of a white person over the, generational pain and trauma of a person of color, Black, Indigenous person of color. That has to come first. So it's, very true, and I can speak to this as a white person. It is uncomfortable. It is anxiety producing. It is difficult. Sometimes I am super embarrassed. Sometimes I'm super ashamed, of when something has been brought to my attention. But that is literally a fraction of any pain or hurt that racism causes to people of color. And so if you are going to be a white person engaged in anti-racist work, you have to swallow that truth that, yes, I'm feeling all the feels, and it's going to happen, and it's going to be really hard. And part of my obligation is that that's my work. And I'm not going to put that on anybody else to try to make me feel better, because that's not what this is all about.
And we want to get to that baseline of being able to acknowledge that as a white person, perhaps my privilege helped get me to this point, and it is not allowing other people to succeed the way that they should. And so a couple of the things that Robin talks about in her book is how white people have no racial stamina. And we pointed out, we don't have to go over it again. We talked about it some in the last episode, but we've never had to identify necessarily as white, and that's always been the norm, is the way that you put it. And so one of the things that she also goes on, and this is very typical, is she talks about intentions and how intentions somehow trump actions.
Yeah, I think there's two things here. The first being this idea of intention, and what anti-racist scholars and practitioners would say is you have to put intention in its place, that it does have a role in all of this, but it's a very small role, actually. That what matters most is impact. So if the impact of your words or your actions have the effect of reinforcing racial disparities or racist tropes or discrimination of any kind or marginalization of any kind, then that's what happened. And you have to take responsibility for that, regardless of your impact. Mm-hmm. That's like 101 anti-racist work. I think it is worthwhile to think about intent if you are part of the team or people who are trying to figure out kind of what to do next. So let's say I'm an administrator, you are a teacher in my school, some kind of incident happened that had really negative impacts on students of color in your classroom. And after talking with you, I get that this was not your intent. To the kid, it doesn't matter. Like, they're hurting, right? So they could probably care less about your intent. That's my number one focus as the administrator. But my second focus is, like, what next? If I can tell that your intent was not to hurt them, then I have a different set of strategies for what to do next with you. Okay. If I talk with you, I'm like, dang, this guy, like, meant to do that. Then we're going to have a talk about employment, right? Like, why would I put you in the position of continuing to hurt kids if you have zero intention of getting better or you don't think there was anything wrong with what you did? Like, I'm going to have a different set of strategies to deal with you based on that. But that intent matters only with, like, what happens next for your intervention. If I'm thinking about the hurt done to this kid, I don't need to think about intent at all.
So let me flash you back. You were at least remotely part of a conversation. We had an incident last December, January. It was during a basketball game where someone in our student body started making animal sounds, something that I was told, happens at a lot of different games, and it came to our attention as a district from multiple different sources. This was not just one source, it was multiple different sources that it was heard and received as a racist chant. And I remember going through that process, superintendent and I, you were involved and others were involved about, okay, what do we do now? And we did our best to own that because based on the work that we had done, a lot of the Facebook comments, social media comments, and actually probably people in person too said, well, that's not what the students meant. That's not what they intended. That's not what they meant. But that versus what was received was two very different things. And so maybe use that as an example.
Well, and I think in that, so I have a lot of questions about that. First would be, how does anyone know for sure what the intent was of every single kid who made those noises or who stood by and did nothing to stop it? How do we know for sure what their intent was? So so what white fragility would ask is for the people who rushed to who their first response to that situation wasn't, oh my God, how are the kids doing who heard that? Are they okay? Like, what can we do for them? Their knee-jerk reaction is to defend the kids who were doing it to make sure nothing bad happens to them, right? Like, white fragility would ask, why? Why is that the knee-jerk response? Where is that coming from? Whose needs is that serving? What is that defending and protecting? That's kind of the reflection questions to ask. And again, it's thinking about whose needs to put first, right? So that would be something to consider. I think ultimately those situations, I think that's a classic example of where regardless of intent, then we do have to deal with the harm done. The other question I would have as a former high school teacher is, let's say best case scenario is there was zero negative intent. That means we have a whole bunch of super ignorant, clueless kids engaging in actions that are clearly going to be interpreted a particular way that they apparently have no idea are going to be interpreted that way. That's best case scenario. That's bad. That's still not great. So what that would call us to do is, wow, we have a major intervention so that our students that we feel this like urge to protect and come to the defense of, I would hope, won't want them engaging in the world in ways that are doing all sorts of harm and damage that they, quote, don't intend to do. If that is the case, and that's best case scenario, we have our work cut out for us to make sure that our young people aren't engaging and using any privilege or advantage or dominant identity that they have in reckless ways. And I think that's the real charge. And this is back to the previous episode, why we would push against colorblindness, why we would advocate for very clear anti-racist education, is we don't want clueless white kids hurting people without, quote, intending to. That is not good. And the only way to counter that is to be very deliberate with them. There's a wonderful book called Raising White Kids by Jen Harvey, who's a professor at Drake University in Des Moines, that nails this just point by point by point, thinking specifically about parenting and why it's so important that white parents have very explicit conversations and learning and educational experiences with their kids around these kinds of issues and things, and honoring the fact that for families with non-dominant identities, whether that's racialized or religious or national or whatever, they have to have those conversations just for the sake of protecting and helping their kids be strategic in the world. So if you find yourself in the position of your kid having some kind of dominant identity, I would hope you don't want them to be like a bull in a china shop, knocking things over willy-nilly, and then, saying, oh, yeah, I didn't mean to hurt you. They have the power to hurt people. And so we have to be really thoughtful and deliberate with them about what that power is and how they can leverage it for good and not for damage, for harm.
So from a district standpoint, how do you suggest, and you're experiencing it as well, working with us, where I think there are a bunch of teachers, administrators, staff members who are much closer to where you're at and very passionate in this area. And then you have other teachers who just aren't there yet. They're probably still
earlier on in the process.
Yeah, very early in the process. And I think that's going to be common in every industry because we all come from different places. They all come from different places.
Yes. It's very in flux. There's no static, you've scored a 93 and now you're a black belt in this. It's constantly shifting.
Yeah. So how do you wade through that?
As a facilitator?
Sure, as a facilitator, but then even advice for a school district to be able to take that on.
In a nutshell, I think the advice that I would have, and this is certainly not just me, I'm thinking also of a great scholar and practitioner in anti-oppressive education is Paul Gorski. He's written a lot about this. I think he's come to speak to Ames before. And he and I have done some work together. And one of the things that we recommend, as well as others, is just like you have to center the needs and comfort of the people with non-dominant identities, their needs come first. It's not to say we totally ignore or dismiss the needs of people with dominant identities, but that has to come second. You cannot pace yourself to the most novice person in your institution or your organization, because if you do that, you will never go anywhere. You will never get very far. Right. So the idea is pace yourself where the people are on the cutting edge, the people who are really pushing the conversation and pushing the envelope. That's who you hitch to. That's what you set your pace and agenda to, and then expect everyone else to get on board. And it isn't to say you just leave them to their own devices to try to figure that out. You offer tons of supports and entry points and access points to encourage people to get with the program. But you certainly do not set your agenda to the people who are the most resistant or the least far along in the process. And there's a huge temptation to do that because it feels for people in privileged positions as the safest way to go, or maybe the least uncomfortable way to do it. But it does not do anybody who's hurting in the system any favors. Yeah. And it again is privileging and centering the needs of the people who are privileged most by the system and who have the least natural incentive to make any changes. So that just is common sense, that if that's who you're prioritizing, it shouldn't be a surprise that things don't change, because they're the ones who are least likely to actually push for any change. So the idea is, in an organization, and this is what Dr. Spikes and I have been trying to do with Ames, is to build up a critical mass of people who can help push that even further. So it isn't just one or two people on the edge and, they feel lonely and burned out. You're trying to build up a community and a network of solidarity so people can really push things forward. You had mentioned this earlier, that there's like individual personal growth, and there's also this like together we're growing as a community, and that they both are kind of happening at the same time. And what Daniel often says is that it's an inside out approach. And I think one piece that's
a good way to put it. Yeah.
You start with yourself, and then you think about like you yourself in relation to others and the systems. One thing I think that can be really hard for some people is, especially for educators that often are super pragmatic and just say, give me what to do on Monday so I can fix this problem. Like, help me fix it tomorrow. Because the vast majority of educators absolutely want to do right by kids, right? So they're like, yep, we hear that there's a problem. I don't really need to know the why, what, whatever. Just tell me what to do differently, and I'll do something differently.
And I'll fix it.
I'll fix it. What Daniel and I have said over and over is we can't give people tools without developing this consciousness, because the tool itself actually can do damage if you're not doing it with the right mindset and the right care and
it's all about the lens.
Exactly.
It's how you see the world. It's how you see your classroom. It's how you see your students. And I highlighted something here because I didn't want to forget to talk about it, but it's ongoing self-awareness.
Absolutely.
And you can be 2 weeks into this, you can be 2 months, 2 years. That self-awareness will never end.
Right.
It has to always continue. And then you start to see not only yourself, but you start to see your classroom, you start to see other classrooms, you start to see the building. And then beyond that, continuing education and relationship building. Can you talk about the relationship part?
Sure.
Or the continuing education part?
Well, first, the continuing ed part, I think 2 things that a district can do that really help. One is to make it clear that this personal growth is professional growth. Like, doing that personal work isn't a waste of time. It isn't irrelevant. It's foundational. And so making it really clear that that work actually is fundamental to creating a really different way of doing things in a system. So prioritizing that. And secondly, creating a community of relationships, like creating trust and a willingness to be vulnerable with each other, that is incredibly important. And if you can't develop that kind of community where people are willing to be honest about their experiences, because often, let's just take race as one example, often white people are like, well, I have no idea. I have friends of color and they've never told me that they have problems. Well, that doesn't mean there aren't problems. That might mean that they don't trust you to tell them your problems, right? Like, this assumption that if I don't hear anything bad, nothing bad is happening is a really naive, very privileged way of thinking about the world. And so it's creating a culture and community where people feel like they can put out on the table the hurts that they have and trust that something will be done with that information, that it won't just fall flat, that it's going to matter to people that they're experiencing, the short end of the stick in the system. The other piece of it is vulnerability on the flip side with anyone who has a dominant identity is, a feeling that I'm, like you said earlier, you outed yourself like, oh God, I can't believe I just said that. Like, you and I have a relationship where I think you feel safe saying to me like, oh, I just stepped in it, knowing that I'm going to say like, that's great, Eric. Like, good job for noticing. Like, good job.
Sure.
I don't read it as like, well, there's another thing Eric said that was stupid. It's like a sense that that you are wanting to keep growing and that you want that feedback. And I think especially, I grew up in Iowa. I grew up in West Des Moines, Iowa. And I think there is, I will just speak for myself, but I felt very much like the environment I grew up in was fairly conflict averse and like fairly passive aggressive. And, when I went out east to teach in Connecticut, the way people interact, and if they've got a problem, this is my problem. It wasn't couched in like compliment, small suggestion, compliment, that there was just regionally really different ways to interact. And so I think one thing we, especially in the Midwest or in communities or cultures where conflict or disagreement is seen as negative or a bad thing, that it is also about coming to a sense that, making mistakes, seeking out feedback, like really wanting constructive criticism and not internalizing it like, oh, I'm a terrible person, but like, oh, no, I need this to be a better person. that can take a while to shift. And I think a lot of schools have the operation of, I go to my classroom, I shut my door, maybe once a year someone comes and watches my teaching, and that's it. Shifting that to saying, I want people to watch me. I want it pointed out what I'm doing that is intentionally or unintentionally hurting certain groups of kids. Like, I really need that information. I want to know. And feeling like you have a trusting, collegial, supportive, comfortable being vulnerable kind of community. And that can take a long time to build. And that, that work has to happen if you're going to ever have any conversations about any issue, to be able to establish, it's not safe space. I know this is something scholars say a lot. Safe space, sometimes people interpret as where no one's feelings will be heard or everyone will leave feeling really awesome. Right. It's space where you are willing to put yourself out there. And we read this article by a scholar named Margaret Wheatley. It's called Willing to be Disturbed. And it's the sense of like, what do you need from everyone else to really put yourself out there and expose your vulnerabilities and your weaknesses and get feedback about that? Like, what makes you feel willing to do that? And sometimes even in our own relationships, our friendships, our marriages, that's not easy to do. So there are times where some of this work feels like group therapy a little bit. Like, how are we all going to relate to each other in a way that's constructive?
So my first professional teaching position was at a school where providing as staff members and teachers, providing feedback was a part of the norm. And I will tell you that as a 23-year-old teacher, getting feedback for the first time was not like something that I was used to. I mean, for all the reasons that you said, but as it happens over time, it becomes very comfortable and normal because you know where they're coming from with the feedback.
And
it's
you've benefited
to improve.
from
and
it.
I've benefited, and then you get to a position where you can provide feedback. And but what it did is that it allowed for conversations to happen.
Right.
And I think that's incredibly important.
It is. And once you go to a system that doesn't have that, it feels really jarring. I mean, just even thinking about really basic things like when you're meeting as a staff, are people sitting in their cliques and people have their computers out and their phones out and people are half paying attention? Well, yeah, I don't care what we're talking about. It's not going to be that meaningful. But are we sitting in a circle where everyone can see each other and everyone is held accountable and pushed back and everyone's expected to talk and share and willing to pose questions and, we don't expect a resolution. Another book we use is Courageous Conversations About Race by Linton and Singleton. And there are 4 agreements that Daniel Spikes and I and lots of other people use. And one of those agreements to do this work and be in community with each other is to expect and accept non-closure. That's something else that's hard is sometimes we want everything wrapped up in a nice, neat little bow and we want to leave a meeting and like everyone feel good about everything and I'm not mad at you, you're not mad at me. And I think the other piece to untangle is, people need to be able to push against something that you said in a meeting or a policy that we really have to talk about that we know is doing damage and let's talk about it. And I think sometimes one of the knee-jerk defensive reactions is, well, you're attacking me. You don't like me as a person, or to make it like an interpersonal thing when really it's bigger. The very first thing you asked about with that example of the basketball game, I think something that a lot of schools get caught up in is a parent or a student will express hurt, will express frustration with something that's happening based on their membership in a group that's disadvantaged, right? And they'll have every reason in the world to say, like, this isn't right. And sometimes what the system expects is for them to make that request in a particular tone of voice, at a particular time, in a particular place, and to ask nicely. And if you do that, then maybe we'll do something nice. Even though history would show that's not how injustice gets overturned. It's not by people just asking nicely enough. That's not how it happens. So when you're in a position of power and you have people from the position of marginalization or minoritization trying to make clear to you what's happening, it's easy to get caught up in how they're telling you and to take them to task for that or to focus on that instead of saying, like, look, maybe I don't like that you disrupted this meeting and that's how you're telling me you're upset, but that's kind of beside the point. If I'm going to build trust with you, I'm going to hear what you're saying and I'm going to take some action, and I'm going to honor what you're saying and validate it, even if it came in a way we don't like.
Well, Katy,
Yeah.
I think we have to wrap up.
That's
Part
okay.
2, we did 2 parts. This is crazy.
It was
We're going to
great.
have to do another at some point. We can continue to talk about it.
Well, and you'll have Daniel here. So
I will,
that'll be
yes.
good.
Yes, we will. He's already on the hook, so I'm going to hold him to it. So,
That'll be great.
Well, I want to thank everyone for listening or watching this episode of the Amazing Education Podcast. Please subscribe to it, share it, tell everyone about it, because we want everyone to be able to hear about not only this, but all of the topics that we talk about. So thank you again.
Thanks, Eric. We appreciate it.